Don't worry, you are safe now.
The moment Margaret Chen had stepped off the ship in San Francisco in 1888, she had understood that she had made a terrible mistake. The man who had promised her honest work in America, who had paid for her passage from China and assured her that she would earn enough money to eventually bring her family over, was nowhere to be found. Instead, she was met by a woman named Lotus, who smiled with false warmth and explained that there had been a change in plans. "Your debt is higher than expected," Lotus had said, her English accented but clear. "The passage cost more than your employer anticipated. You'll work to pay it off." Margaret, who was 17 years old and spoke minimal English, realized within hours that she had been trafficked, that the promises of honest work had been lies, that she was now property, sold to the highest bidder, her body transformed into a commodity, her future stolen before it had truly begun. She had spent the next 2 years in a brothel in San Francisco, trapped in a cycle of debt that only increased with each passing month. The money she earned, and she did earn money, though most of it went to her keepers, was tallied in ways designed to ensure she would never be free. Food cost money. Clothing cost money. Medicine cost money. The room she slept in cost money. Every expense was added to her debt, ensuring that no matter how hard she worked, she would never escape. The other women in the brothel were from different countries, speaking different languages, united only in their shared enslavement. Margaret learned Spanish, Japanese, Korean, a linguistic tapestry born of suffering. She learned which customers were least violent, which ones could be managed with charm rather than resistance, which ones required absolute submission. She learned how to survive hell. But surviving wasn't living, and Margaret had begun to understand that her survival was finite. The conditions were brutal. The diseases were rampant. Several of the women she'd arrived were already dead, from illness, from suicide, from violence. Margaret understood that she was on a trajectory toward her own death, just with a different timeline than some of the others. She had stopped hoping for rescue. She had stopped believing that anyone cared whether she lived or died. She had resigned herself to the inevitable. Then, in the spring of 1890, a man arrived at the brothel with a federal agent and a warrant. His name was Samuel Harrison, and he was a rancher from Wyoming who had come to San Francisco on business. He had discovered, quite by accident, that a woman from his town, a young woman named Lucy who had disappeared 2 years earlier, was being held in a brothel. He had contacted federal authorities, and together they had begun investigating the trafficking networks that operated along the coast. What they discovered was staggering in its scope and horror. Hundreds of women, maybe thousands, had been brought across state lines through fraud and coercion. They were held in conditions of abject servitude, their debts deliberately inflated to ensure permanent enslavement. The brothel where Margaret had been held was shut down. The women were freed. And for the first time in 2 years, Margaret stood in a room that wasn't prison, surrounded by people who weren't her captors. But freedom, she discovered, was more complicated than she had imagined. The federal authorities offered the women shelter and support to return to their countries of origin or to rebuild their lives in America. But for Margaret, both options were impossible. Her family in China believed she was dead or had abandoned them. The shame of her captivity would destroy any possibility of returning to her village. And America, while it had enslaved her, was now the only home she knew. She took a job as a housekeeper for a family in Denver, working long hours for modest wages, living in a cramped room, slowly rebuilding a life from the ashes of her previous existence. But she moved through her days like a ghost, haunted by the trauma she had endured, unable to trust anyone, and carrying a deep shame that she knew, intellectually, was not her fault, but felt like it anyway. It was at a church charity event that she encountered Samuel Harrison again. Samuel had remained involved in the investigation of trafficking networks, working with federal authorities to identify and prosecute those responsible for enslaving women. He had become a vocal advocate for victims of trafficking, using his wealth and influence to support shelters and rehabilitation programs. He had also never forgotten the face of the young Chinese woman he had seen in that brothel. The way her eyes had looked broken but not defeated, traumatized but not destroyed. "Miss Chen," he said, approaching her as she stood alone in a corner of the church social hall, trying to be invisible. "I'm Samuel Harrison. We met briefly when the brothel was shut down." Margaret looked at him warily. She had learned to be suspicious of men, particularly men who sought her out deliberately. "I wanted to check in with you," Samuel continued, his voice gentle and respectful, "to see how you're managing, if you have what you need, if there's anything I can help with." "I'm fine," Margaret replied, her English heavily accented but comprehensible. "I work. I live. I'm fine." "You don't look fine," Samuel said, but not unkindly. "You look like someone carrying a weight that shouldn't be yours to carry alone." Margaret felt something crack inside her, a wall that had been holding back a tsunami of emotion for 2 years. But she couldn't break down in a church social hall. She couldn't let herself be vulnerable. She excused herself and fled into the night. Samuel didn't pursue her immediately, but he also didn't disappear from her life. Over the following weeks and months, he appeared at the charity events where Margaret was required to attend as part of her employment. He spoke to her about his ranch, about Wyoming, about the open sky and the way the mountains made you feel small and free at the same time. He never asked her about her trauma. He never made her feel like she was defined by what had happened to her. And slowly, impossibly, Margaret began to trust him. 6 months after they reconnected, Samuel made an extraordinary proposal. "I have a ranch in Wyoming," he told her as they sat on a bench outside the church after a service. "It's a good place. Honest work. Fair wages. People who work together rather than compete with each other. I have a housekeeper, but I'm looking to expand the operation. I need someone I trust to help manage it. Someone with intelligence and capability and strength. I'm offering you the position. Fair wages, your own room, complete autonomy. You can leave any time you choose to leave. No debt, no obligation, no servitude of any kind." "Why?" Margaret asked, the single word carrying all her confusion and suspicion. "Because you deserve to have a choice about your own life," Samuel replied. "And because I believe that giving opportunity to someone society has written off is one of the best things a person can do with their resources." Margaret went to Wyoming. The Coulter Ranch, which Samuel had named after a friend who had helped him in the investigation, was unlike anywhere Margaret had ever been. It was a place of genuine community, where workers were treated fairly, where women's contributions were valued, where no one asked intrusive questions about Margaret's past or treated her as damaged goods. She worked alongside Samuel managing the household, and eventually the business operations. She learned to ride horses. She learned the rhythms of ranching. She learned what it felt like to be valued for her competence rather than exploited for her body. And over time, as her trauma slowly began to heal, as nightmares became less frequent, as a constant state of hypervigilance began to ease, Margaret found herself developing feelings for Samuel that went beyond gratitude. It took her months to admit these feelings even to herself, and longer still to consider expressing them. But Samuel, watching her heal and transform, had his own realization. He had fallen in love with her, not because he had rescued her, but because of who she was becoming, and who she had always been beneath the trauma. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel took Margaret's hand. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to know that this comes with no expectations and no obligation. I've fallen in love with you, not out of pity or a savior complex, but because you're remarkable, because you survived something that should have destroyed you, and instead of being destroyed, you became stronger, because your intelligence and your humor and your capacity to care about other people inspire me every single day." He paused, and Margaret saw tears in his eyes. "I'm asking if you consider marrying me," Samuel continued, "not because it would solve anything or make anything better, but because I want to build a life with you, because I want to wake up every morning next to a woman I respect and admire and love, because I want you to know with absolute certainty that you are valued beyond measure." Margaret said yes through tears, and they were married the following spring in a small ceremony attended by the community that had embraced her. The marriage was a partnership of equals. Samuel made sure Margaret understood that her consent was necessary for every decision that affected her life. He made sure she knew she could say no to anything, including the marriage itself, without consequence. And he made sure she understood that she was a full partner in their life together, not a rescued damsel. but a woman who had survived the unsurvivable and deserved to claim her own power. Margaret became known throughout Wyoming as a woman of remarkable strength and wisdom. She helped other trafficking victims who came to the territory, offering them shelter at the ranch and helping them rebuild their lives. She became an advocate for stricter laws against trafficking and for support services for survivors. Years later, when people asked Margaret about the moment she decided to trust Samuel, she would speak of the exhaustion of maintaining her walls, the terror of vulnerability, and the slow realization that some people could be trusted. But she would always emphasize that Samuel's greatest gift wasn't rescuing her. It was giving her the space and support to rescue herself. "I saved myself," Margaret would say. "The moment I walked out of that brothel, I became my own rescuer. Samuel didn't save me. He believed in me. He valued me. He created space for me to heal. Those are different things. And that distinction matters because it means I don't owe him my life. I gave my life to him as a gift, freely chosen, because being with him makes my life richer." And Margaret lived out her days in Wyoming, surrounded by mountains and open sky, building a legacy not victimhood but survival, not of rescue but redemption. The kind of redemption that comes from within, supported by the genuine love and respect of someone who sees your worth and refuses to let the world convince you otherwise.